My husband's future is with me now, and every single person at this table knows it. Catherine Beaumont said it, without lowering her voice. She said it the way someone says a thing they have been rehearsing for weeks, sharp and clean and loud enough to carry across the entire length of the private dining room at the Thornfield Club, which on that particular Thursday evening in October held 63 people, most of whom had known the Ashworth family for decades. She was 26 years old, wearing a dress the color of winter wheat, and she was smiling at Eleanor Ashworth across a table set with white linen and crystal that had been in the Thornfields collection since before Catherine's parents were born. Eleanor did not move. She did not flinch. She sat at the head of the table where she had sat every year at the firm's anniversary dinner for the past 19 years. And she looked at the young woman her son had brought into this room, as though she were reading a document that contained no surprises whatsoever. If you have ever been written off by someone who thought they already knew the ending, stay with me. Drop your city in the comments right now. I want to see where this story reaches. And if you haven't subscribed to Velvet Confessions yet, do it now, because this one is only just beginning. Eleanor Ashworth had known about Catherine Beaumont for 4 months and 11 days. She had not learned about it from her son. She had not hired anyone to find out. She had not done what other women in her position might have done, called her daughter-in-law. In a panic, confronted her son over dinner, made the mistake of moving before she understood the full shape of what she was dealing with. She had simply paid attention, and Eleanor Ashworth, who had spent 31 years building Ashworth Capital Partners from a 2-person operation cleaner on Richmond Street into one of the most quietly formidable private equity firms in Toronto, paid attention the way other people breathed, without effort, without interruption, and without ever stopping. She had noticed it first in May, when her son Philip arrived at her birthday dinner. At the Hazelton 20 minutes late and slightly too composed. The particular composure of a man who has rehearsed an explanation and is relieved he doesn't have to use it. She noticed the way he checked his phone twice under the table. She noticed that when her daughter-in-law, Meredith, leaned over to say something to him, he smiled at the right moment. But his eyes were already somewhere else, Eleanor noticed. She said nothing because Eleanor Ashworth had not survived 31 years in a business that did not, traditionally, welcome women her age by speaking before she understood exactly what she was saying, and to whom she watched. She waited. She catalogued. By July, she knew enough. By September, she knew everything. And when the Thornfield Club's annual Ashworth Capital anniversary dinner was being organized and her son's name appeared on the guest list alongside one Catherine Beaumont, listed under the Beaumont financial corporate seat, as though the seating arrangement were simple logistical, Eleanor had looked at it for a long moment and then said to her assistant, a meticulous woman named Sandra, leave it exactly as it is. Sandra, who had worked for Eleanor for 11 years, she had learned early that when Eleanor said leave it, she was not being passive, she was being precise. The car to the Thornfield on the night of the dinner took 14 minutes. Eleanor sat in the back of it and thought about her son. Philip had been 29 when he came into the firm. She had given him that deliberately. Waited until he was old enough to understand what he was walking into, young enough to still have the hunger for it. He had her father's instinct for risk and her own eye for timing, and for 12 years he had been, professionally, exactly the partner she had hoped he would become. The rest of it, the choices he made in the private hours, the slow, quiet deterioration of his marriage to Meredith, the Catherine Beaumont situation, that she had watched with the particular grief of a woman who understood that you could not protect people you loved from the consequences of their own decisions. You could only ensure that when those consequences arrived, they arrived on your terms. She had spoken to her brother Walter 3 weeks before the dinner. Walter Ashworth, 67 years old, who had spent 4 decades as a senior partner at one of Bay Street's oldest law firms, and who communicated primarily in half sentences that his family had spent decades learning to complete correctly. "We're ready when you are," he'd said. "Whenever you give the word." "Not yet," Eleanor had told him. "I'll know the evening." There was a pause on his end. Then, "The Beaumont girl is going to be there. I know, and Philip knows you know?" "He doesn't." Walter was quiet for a moment. He processed things at his own pace and always had. "Then, you're sure about the timing?" Eleanor had thought about this. About 19 years of anniversary dinners at the Thornfield. About the fact that Philip had chosen this specific event to bring Catherine Beaumont into. This specific room full of clients and board members and old friends of the firm, people who had trusted the Ashworth name through market corrections and leadership transitions, and the particular turbulence of 3 decades in private equity. "He brought her here," Eleanor said. A silence. Then Walter, in the voice he used when he understood exactly what she meant. "I'll be there by 9. The Thornfield Club's private dining room was everything it had always been. Dark wood, warm light, the quiet confidence of a room designed to make certain kinds of people feel that everything was in its right place. Eleanor arrived at 7:30 and moved through it the way she always did. Without hurry, without performance, with the particular ease of a woman for whom this room was simply one of many rooms that had arranged itself around her over the years. She greeted clients. She spoke briefly with the firm's CFO, a steady man named David Park, who had been with Ashworth Capital. For 9 years she accepted a glass of wine from a passing server and did not drink it immediately. Meredith arrived at 7:45. Eleanor had called her the day before, not to explain, not to warn in any specific way, just to make sure she was coming, to make sure she knew to come early. Meredith was 38 years old, and she was Philip's wife of 11 years, and she was, Eleanor had always thought, considerably more perceptive than Philip had given her credit for. She arrived in a dark green dress that suited her well, and she looked at Eleanor with the expression of a woman who understood that something was happening, even if she did not yet know the shape of it. "You look composed," Eleanor said. Meredith held her gaze. "I've had practice." Eleanor took her arm briefly. "You won't need to do anything tonight," she said. "Just stay close to me." Meredith looked at her for a moment, this woman she had married into, who had never been easy and had never been particularly warm, but who had always, in the ways that mattered most, shown up. She nodded once. The dinner began. Courses came and went. The conversation at Eleanor's table was, as it always was, competent and pleasant and constructed of the kind of professional relationship maintenance that made events like this one simultaneously important and entirely forgettable. She spoke to 2 limited partners from Vancouver who were in town for the week. She complimented the Thornfield's new sommelier on a choice she had already known he would make. She was present. She was gracious. She was also watching the table at the far end of the room where her son sat with his back slightly too straight and his attention slightly too divided between his conversations and whatever was happening at Catherine Beaumont's table. 4 seats to his left, Catherine Beaumont was 26. She had come to the Beaumont financial seat as a junior associate and had, from what Eleanor had gathered, positioned herself over 14 months with the particular focused determination of a person who understood that proximity was its own form of currency. She was quick. Eleanor gave her that. She was quick and she was confident, and she had, on this particular evening, dressed and carried herself with the deliberate care of someone who had decided in advance that tonight was going to be significant. She was right about that. She was wrong about how. Eleanor watched her across the room, across the white tablecloths, and the candlelight, and the careful social architecture of a dinner that had been running for 19 years. She watched her look at Philip. She watched the small private language that moved between them when their eyes met, the language of 2 people who believe their secret is smaller than it actually is. One of the Vancouver partners, a woman named Patricia, leaned slightly toward Eleanor. Her voice was polite and curious and touched with something Eleanor recognized as the particular alertness of someone who had been watching the same thing she had. "Philip seems distracted this evening," Eleanor turned to for her with the full composed attention she gave everything. "He has a great deal on his mind," she said. "Growing pains. We're entering a significant new phase for the firm." She let that land, not dismissively, but with the particular confidence of a woman who controlled the narrative of her own organization. Patricia nodded and asked about the new phase, and Eleanor redirected the conversation with the ease of someone who had been doing exactly this for 30 years. At 9:15, Philip stood up. He stood the way men stood when they had decided something and were carrying the weight of that decision, and believed that the momentum of it would carry them through whatever came next. He was 41 years old, and he was wearing the gray suit he always wore to the Thornfield. And he cleared his throat once, and the room, because he was Philip Ashworth, because his name was on the wall beside the entrance, because certain men occupied certain rooms in certain ways, went quiet. "I want to say something," he began, and his voice was steady in the way voices were steady when their owners had practiced the steadiness. "About this firm, about what we build here, about having the courage," he paused, "to be honest about where your energy is and where your future is going." The room was listening. It was the particular listening of people who had not been expecting a speech and were recalibrating around one. "Some chapters close," he said, "and new ones begin. And I think," he paused again, "the most important thing is to stop pretending otherwise." Eleanor sat with both hands in her lap and her back completely straight, and her expression, which was the expression of a woman receiving information she has long since already processed, gave away nothing. Philip sat down. He reached for his water. His eyes moved briefly and unmistakably to Catherine's table. The room felt it. Even the people who had not understood the speech understood that something had shifted, that the air in the Thornfield's private dining room had changed. In some way they were still determining, and then Catherine Beaumont stood up. She was holding her wine glass and she was smiling, and there was in her expression the particular brightness of someone who had been waiting for a signal and believed they had just received it. She raised her glass. "To new chapters," she said. Her voice carried the way she had clearly intended it to carry. Warm, ringing, carrying itself across the candlelit tables with the confidence of a woman who believed the room was on her side. "To honest beginnings," she paused. "To Philip, who knows exactly what he wants." She let his name settle into the room the way a stone settles into still water. And then she turned, and she looked directly at Eleanor Ashworth, and she smiled. 63 people in the Thornfield Club's private dining room. 63 people who had built careers in the particular world where reputation and relationship were indistinguishable from currency, who understood exactly what had just been said, and to whom it had been said, and what it meant that it had been said publicly in this specific room. Not one of them raised a glass. The silence was complete and entirely devastating in the way that certain silences are, not empty, but full. Not neutral, but decisive. The silence of a room that has rendered a verdict without needing to deliberate. Catherine's smile held for 3 seconds, then 4. Then something moved across her face. Not yet understanding, but the first small tremor of it. The realization that the room had not answered the way she had expected it to answer. Eleanor set her wine glass on the table. With a care that was not dramatic, but was also not careless, she smoothed the front of her jacket. She rose from her chair with the unhurried inevitability of someone for whom rising was simply the next thing that was going to happen, and nothing in that room was going to change that. She did not look at Philip. She did not look at Catherine. She walked to the center of the room with the measured deliberateness of a woman who had spent 31 years walking into difficult rooms and who knew with absolute certainty that this room was already hers. The door at the back of the dining room opened. The first thing people noticed was the stillness, not uncertainty. The stillness of something large and decided arriving at its destination. Walter Ashworth walked in. 67 years old, in the dark suit he wore to Bay Street, moving with the contained authority of a man who had argued before the Ontario Court of Appeal 40 times and had stopped finding any room intimidating somewhere around 1997. Beside him was his son, Eleanor's nephew, Theo Ashworth, 35, a managing director at RBC, whose presence in any room involving Ashworth Capital had specific and well-understood implications. And 2 steps behind them, a man Eleanor had called the previous week, Jeffrey Strand, the firm's primary institutional backer, 62 years old, whose fund held 23% of Ashworth Capital's investor structure, and who had flown in from Vancouver that morning, for reasons he had communicated to no one except Eleanor. Philip Ashworth saw Jeffrey Strand and went the color of old concrete. Eleanor did not turn around. She could see the moment arrive on her son's face as clearly as if she were reading it. The precise instant when the full architecture of what he had done and what he had failed to understand about the woman he had spent his entire professional life working alongside collapsed into something cold and irreversible. He had thought he was announcing a personal decision. He had not understood that a personal decision made publicly in a room full of the firm's most significant relationships was not personal at all. He had not understood that when you chose this room for this moment, you were choosing chances that extended far beyond anything a private conversation could have produced. Walter moved through the room with the ease of a man who belonged in every room he entered. He reached Eleanor and stood beside her and said nothing for a moment. Then quietly, "We're here. I see that," she said. Geoffrey Strand crossed to where Eleanor stood. He was not a demonstrative man. She had known him for 16 years and had never seen him be demonstrative. He shook her hand once firmly and said, "Thank you for the call this week. I thought it was important to be here in person." The weight of that sentence landed the way Eleanor had known it would land, in the ears of every person in that room who understood what Geoffrey Strand's presence meant. His fund's participation in Ashworth Capital was not decorative. It was structural. And Geoffrey Strand had flown from Vancouver to stand next to Eleanor Ashworth on a Thursday night. The room understood. The room was full of people whose professional survival depended on reading exactly this kind of signal, and they read it with the swift precision of long practice. Philip had not moved from his chair. He was sitting there with his water glass still in his hand, and his face arranged in the careful composure of a man trying very hard to manage the optics of a situation that had moved past the point where optics were manageable. He was smart enough. Eleanor had always known he was smart, to feel the shape of it even before he understood the specifics. The shape was not good. Catherine Beaumont was still standing. That was the thing that several people noted afterward when they replayed the evening. She had not sat down when the Ashworths entered. She was still holding her glass, still present in the room, in the way she had positioned herself, but the confidence had begun to leave her posture the way warmth left a room when the heating failed. Gradually, then, all at once. She was running a calculation. Eleanor could see it from where she stood. Catherine was trying to place Walter and Geoffrey, trying to understand why their entrance had caused the room to shift so completely, trying to use the information she had to map the situation she was in. She didn't have enough information. That was her problem. She had researched Philip. She had researched the firm's recent performance, its portfolio, its growth trajectory. She had understood Philip Ashworth, the professional, and Philip Ashworth, the man. She had not understood Philip Ashworth, the son, what it meant, in the specific institutional and relational architecture of Bay Street, to be Eleanor Ashworth's son, what the Ashworth name carried, that had nothing to do with Philip, and everything to do with the woman who had spent 31 years building it before he ever set foot in the building. She was about to understand. Walter moved toward Philip's table with the efficiency of a man who had decided where he was going and had no interest in the scenic route. He stopped 6 feet away and looked at his nephew with the expression of someone who was not angry, who was in fact entirely calm, which was Philip knew from a lifetime of experience considerably worse than anger. "Philip." Walter's voice was even, pleasant, even. "I hope the dinner has been enjoyable." The two women sitting nearest to Philip's table had both gone very still. Philip set his glass down. He looked at his uncle, Uncle Walter. His voice was controlled, running through calculations. "What are you?" "Your mother's firm," Walter said. "Her name on the door. We're here to support her as we always are." A pause, brief and pointed, "And to support the firm, of course, as we've always done." It was not a statement. It was a perimeter being drawn clearly, and without drama around an institution, that certain people in this room had just publicly attempted to destabilize, and around the woman who had built that institution, in full view of the relationships that institution depended on. Philip looked at Walter. Then he looked past him to Geoffrey Strand. Something moved through his face. "Uncle Walter." His voice was quieter now. "This isn't the place." "I agree completely," Walter said. which is why I'm going to suggest we address certain matters without making the firm's anniversary dinner into more of an occasion than it's already become." He let the word occasion do what it needed to do. Then he glanced, once, briefly, toward Catherine Beaumont's table. Catherine was sitting down now. The glass was on the table in front of her. Her hands were folded. Geoffrey Strand stepped forward. He did not raise his voice. He had never in Eleanor's experience raised his voice. "Philip," he said, "just the name, and then, I think it would be useful for the three of us to have a conversation. Not tonight. Tonight belongs to the firm and to Eleanor." He let his eyes move comprehensively across the room. But soon he stepped back, that was all. No ultimatum delivered in explicit language, no dramatic confrontation. Just Geoffrey Strand, whose fund held 23% of the firm's investor structure, telling Philip Ashworth that a conversation was required, in a room where 40 people with relevant professional stakes had just witnessed it happen. It was, in its quietness, the most significant thing that had occurred in that room all evening. At the table nearest Eleanor's, a man named Conrad Yee, who had been a limited partner in Ashworth Capital for 8 years, and who had been watching the entire sequence of events with the particular focused attention of someone recognizing a pattern he had seen before, leaned across to his wife and said 2 words so quietly that only she heard them. She nodded, without looking at him, because she had been married to a man in finance for 27 years, and she understood exactly what those 2 words meant. Meredith had not moved from Eleanor's side. She had stood there through all of it, through Philip's speech, through Catherine's toast, through the entrance, through the quiet, calculated conversation between Walter and Philip, with a stillness that was not passivity. It was the stillness of a woman deciding something, and Eleanor, who recognized that particular stillness, let her have it. At the Beaumont financial table, a colleague of Catherine's, who had come to the dinner as part of the corporate group, and who had been gradually increasing the distance between her chair and Crane's throughout the past 20 minutes, excused herself from the table. She did not come back. Catherine sat alone in her wheat-colored dress and looked at the room that had not moved in her direction, and for the first time since she had walked into the Thornfield that evening with the measured confidence of a woman who believed she had already won, she allowed herself to feel the first edge of what was actually happening. She had not won. She had not come close to winning. She had walked into a situation she had fundamentally misread and made herself the most visible person in the room at the exact wrong moment, and 63 people who knew exactly what visibility meant in this world had watched her do it. Her toast echoed in her own memory. To honest beginnings, the raised glass, the smile, the name spoken into the room. In the silence of beginning to understand what it had actually cost, it felt less like a beginning and more like an ending she would be managing for a very long time. Eleanor found Meredith at her elbow. "Are you all right?" Meredith asked. Her voice was quiet and entirely genuine. Eleanor considered the question, the way she considered every question, with complete attention and without sentiment. "I'm exactly as I expected to be," she said. She paused. "You?" Meredith looked across the room at Philip, who was now in low, urgent conversation with Walter, his composure finally beginning to show the strain it had been hiding all evening. She looked at him for a long moment, the way people looked at things they had loved, and were in the process of understanding they had lost. "I've known for a while," she said. "I just didn't know how far it had gone." Eleanor heard this. She did not offer false comfort. "I'm sorry," she said, and she meant it in the particular way she meant things, not as a performance but as an acknowledgement of something real. "I'm sorry it came to this room." Meredith nodded. She reached for her water glass. She straightened her spine. "All right," she said. "What happens now?" Eleanor looked at her. She thought about 11 years of watching this woman sit at her son's side at dinners, like this one. 11 years of quietly absorbing the particular difficulty of being married to a man whose ambitions had always, in the end, been organized around his own reflection. She thought about what it would cost Meredith and what it would free her from. "Now," Eleanor said, "we let Walter handle the parts that need handling, and we finish the dinner." Meredith almost smiled. Almost. Then she said, "Will you sit with me? I don't particularly want to sit at that table right now." Eleanor took her arm. Of course, she said. They walked together to a small table near the window, and a server appeared immediately with water and a bread basket. Because this was the Thornfield Club, and servers at the Thornfield understood the geometry of difficult evenings. Meredith sat. Eleanor sat across from her. Outside the window, Toronto was doing what Toronto did on October evenings, quietly, indifferently caring. The dinner continued around them. The Thornfield staff, who had been managing the social fallout of Bay Street's private moments for generations, maintained the professional rhythm of the service with the impeccable steadiness of people who had seen considerably worse. Conversations resumed, cautiously at first, and then with the gradual normalcy of rooms that have absorbed something significant and are deciding collectively how much of it to name. Not much, Eleanor knew. Not tonight. Tonight it would stay in the careful language of professional obliqueness. Things said between people who understood each other, things not quite said between people who were still calculating, but the conversations would happen. They were already happening in the small tilts of people's heads and the brief exchanges in corners and the phones, being checked with slightly too much frequency. The morning would be more direct. Meredith looked at her. Across the breadbasket and the small table and the quiet distance from the rest of the room. "What did you know?" she asked. "And when?" Eleanor wrapped both hands around her water glass. "Everything," she said. "For 4 months, Meredith absorbed this. You didn't tell me." "No." "Why?" "Because I needed to understand the full shape of it before anyone moved." Eleanor paused. "And because I needed Philip to make a choice. A real one. Out loud. In a room where it couldn't be walked back." Meredith looked at her. "There's a part of me that wishes you told me sooner." Her voice was even. She was not accusing. She was being honest, in the way that women who had survived things were honest, without the luxury of drama. "I know," Eleanor said. "I'm sorry for that part." Meredith looked out the window for a moment. Then she said, "What happens to him? To Philip?" The firm. Eleanor considered this. She thought about Jeffrey's quiet promise of a conversation, about Walter's careful legal architecture, about the specific nature of the structures she had spent 31 years building, and what they could and could not survive. "What happens," she said, "depends considerably on what Philip decides to do next." She paused. "I've made sure that whatever he decides, the firm's foundation is secure. Meaning the firm doesn't need him." Eleanor held her gaze. "Meaning the firm was here before him, and the most important parts of it will be hereafter, in whatever form makes sense." Meredith nodded slowly. She reached for a piece of bread. She was quiet for a moment, working through something internally in the way people did when they were being honest with themselves, about something they had been half avoiding. "I think I've known it was over for 2 years, she said. "Before any of this. I just didn't want to be the one to say it." Eleanor looked at her. "That's a very honest thing to say." "It's true." Meredith set the bread down. "I think I stayed because I didn't know what came after." She paused. "I still don't, but at least after is actually after now. I know where the line is." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "There's a great deal that comes after. The after is longer than the before, usually." She said it simply, without performance, the way a woman said a thing she had earned the right to say. Meredith looked at her. She had never entirely known what to do with Eleanor. Too contained, too strategic, too much of everything that Meredith herself had been taught to moderate in herself. But sitting at this small table at the edge of the Thornfields' private dining room, while the professional world of Bay Street quietly recalibrated around them, she found that she understood her mother-in-law, perhaps for the first time, with a clarity that had nothing to do with liking and everything to do with recognition. One woman who had built something. One woman who was about to start. At 10:50, Jeffrey Strand appeared at Eleanor's side. He shook her hand again and said he would call on Monday, and that his confidence in the firm's leadership remained exactly what it had always been. He said this at a volume that was not accidental. 3 people within earshot heard it. By 9 o'clock Friday morning, 12 more would have heard some version of it, because that was how rooms like this one worked. Information moved through them the way water moved through good soil. Quietly and completely. Walter left at 10:30 with the economy of a man who had accomplished what he came to accomplish. He touched Eleanor's shoulder briefly as he passed, which from Walter was the equivalent of a standing ovation. Philip approached at 10:45. His composure had recovered. She had raised him after all, and whatever else was true about him, he knew how to hold himself in a difficult room. He stopped in front of her with his hands at his sides and looked at his mother with an expression she had not seen on his face since he was much younger, before the firm and the suits and the particular performance of the man he had decided to become. He looked like her son, just her son. "Mom?" he said. "Philip." She waited. Stopped. He tried again. "I didn't understand what tonight was going to." Eleanor held up one hand. "Not here," she said. "Not tonight." She looked at him steadily. "Monday. My office. 9 o'clock." He held her gaze. He was processing something. She waited for him to finish processing it. Then he said, "Is the firm? Is Jeffrey?" "The firm is fine," she said. "Jeffrey's confidence is intact." She paused. "What happens next depends on the decisions you make in the next several weeks, and the manner in which you make them. I'd suggest thinking very carefully about that this weekend." He looked at her for another moment. She could see him trying to find the angle, the thing that would give him a conversation, some frame in which he was not entirely standing in the rubble of his own choices. He had always been good at finding angles. He couldn't find one. "All right," he said. "Good night, Philip." He left. She watched him go. She allowed herself, in the 30 seconds of time back to disappear through the dining room door, to feel the specific weight of it. Not triumph, not grief, not the satisfaction of having executed a plan. Just the specific, complicated weight of a mother who had watched her son make an irreversible choice and had understood, long before tonight, that she could not make it for him differently. She could only be precise about the consequences. She turned back to Meredith. "Are you driving?" she asked. Meredith looked up. "I was going to take a cab. Come with me." Eleanor touched her arm briefly. "My car is at the front." They rode in silence for a few minutes. The city was quiet, in the way it got after 10 on weeknights, the traffic thinning, the lights running longer at the intersections. Eleanor looked out the window. She thought about the 31 years it had taken to build a thing sturdy enough to survive a night like this one. She thought about what survived and what didn't. Meredith broke the silence first. "What will you do now?" she asked. "After all this settles?" Eleanor turned from the window. She had been thinking about this since June. She had been thinking about it in the particular way. She thought about things she was not yet ready to decide, turning it over carefully, returning to it with more information. "A restructure of the firm's leadership structure," she said. "It's something I've been considering for several years. A transition plan. Walter and Jeffrey have both indicated they'd be supportive, meaning the transition has more flexibility now than it had last year." She paused. "I have a meeting next week with a woman named Constance Reed, who runs a mid-sized venture fund out of Calgary and has been looking to bring her portfolio east. We've been in correspondence for 6 months. The alignment is strong." Meredith looked at her. "So you've been building something?" "I'm always building something," Eleanor said. "That's the only thing I know how to do." They rode the rest of the way in the comfortable silence of two women who had both arrived by different roads at the same specific understanding of an evening that was now behind them. The call from Walter came at 9:15 the next morning. Eleanor was at her kitchen table with her coffee in the Globe and the Friday quiet of her house. He said 3 things: that Philip had called him at 7:30, that the conversation had been, in Walter's estimation, the most honest one they had had in 15 years, and that Philip had asked for a month before a Monday meeting to organize his thoughts. She took the month off the table, Walter said. Gave him 2 weeks. "But he's going to come in. He's going to talk." "Good," Eleanor said. "He also." Walter paused, which was notable because Walter rarely paused, asked how you were. She considered this. She looked out her kitchen window at the October morning, the last of the leaves coming down, in the park, at the end of her street, the particular sharp light of a fall day in Toronto that always reminded her of beginnings somehow, regardless of what it was actually the end of. "Tell him I'm fine," she said. "Tell him I'm building something." Walter made a sound that might in another man have been a laugh. "Monday," he said. 9 o'clock, 9 o'clock, she confirmed. The Monday meeting lasted 4 hours. Eleanor will not recount the specifics of it here because they belong to the private architecture of a family navigating a difficult passage. And because the specifics, in the end, mattered less than the decision that came out of them. Philip agreed to a structured leadership transition. Voluntary. On a timeline that gave the firm stability and gave him enough time to understand what he was transitioning toward. Catherine Beaumont's name was not mentioned once. She had already, as it turned out, removed herself from the situation with considerably less instruction than anyone had anticipated. She had been placed on leave from Beaumont Financial the Friday after the dinner, which, Eleanor had been told secondhand, had more to do with the judgment demonstrated at a client event than with the personal situation, though the two were not entirely separable. She had not contacted Philip since the evening of the dinner, at least not by any channel Eleanor had any visibility into, and Philip, whatever else was true of him, had not contacted her. The thing had ended the way these things ended, when the room they had been built in collapsed beneath them, not with drama, but with the specific gravity of consequences that had made themselves unmistakable. Meredith filed in November. Eleanor did not intervene. It was not her place to intervene, and it was not what Meredith needed. What Meredith needed was for the people around her to treat the decision as the clear and reasonable thing it was, which Eleanor did, and Walter did, and Jeffries Strand did when he wrote a brief note saying that he hoped the transition would be handled with the care it deserved, which was its own particular form of institutional endorsement. Eleanor signed a partnership agreement with Constance Reed in December. The announcement went out the first week of January, through a joint release that led with the combined portfolio logic and the operational alignment, and buried, without apology, the fact that Eleanor Ashworth at 61 was restructuring one of Bay Street's most established private equity firms, not because she had, but because she had decided this was the better shape of the next decade. Her phone started ringing at 8:45 the morning. The release went out. The second call was from Walter. Well, he said, which was the entirety of his commentary, and which she received as the standing ovation it was. The third call was from Jeffrey. He said, "This is a wise structure, Eleanor. I'm glad I came to Toronto in October. I knew you would be," she said. He made a sound that she had come to recognize, after 16 years, as his version of a laugh. The seventh call was from Meredith. Eleanor almost didn't recognize her voice at first. It was lighter than she had heard it in years, or perhaps lighter than she had ever heard it. "I saw the announcement," Meredith said. "It's impressive. It's the right move," Eleanor said. "Are you happy about it?" Eleanor stood at the window of her office at Ashworth Capital, where the view down Bay Street was clear and cold and entirely familiar. She thought about the question. She thought about what happy meant when the context was 31 years of building something, and the particular satisfaction of understanding, at 61, that the building was not finished, that it was, in fact, only now beginning to take the shape she had always intended. "I'm energized," she said. "That's the most honest answer I have." Meredith was quiet for a moment, then, "That's better than happy, I think. That lasts longer." Eleanor turned from the window. She thought that was probably the most accurate thing anyone had said to her in months. The firm's first major announcement under the new partnership structure came in February. A $40 million commitment to a portfolio of women-led technology companies across Ontario and British Columbia, anchored by Constance's Calgary Fund, and underwritten by Jeffrey's continued participation. Eleanor's name was at the top. Not Eleanor Ashworth Hayes, not Mrs. Anything. Eleanor Ashworth, managing partner. Ashworth Reed Capital Partners. Her name first. That was intentional. She did not explain the intention to anyone. She did not need to. Philip called that morning. She expected the call. She picked up. He said, "I saw the announcement. I assumed you would." He was quiet a moment in the way he got quiet when he was managing something complicated internally. Then, "It's a good structure. The Calgary alignment makes sense." "Jeffrey's participation is," he paused. "Smart." "It is," she agreed. A longer silence. She waited. "I wanted to." He stopped, started again. "I wanted to say that I understand what you built," he said. "I understand better now what it cost to build it and what it takes to keep building it." He paused. I haven't always acted in a way that respected that. Eleanor stood at her desk and held the phone and listened to her son say something true. No, she said. You haven't. And then, because it was also true, but you're here. You're in the conversation. That's where you build slowly. Something releasing. Yeah, he said. Okay. What are you doing next? She asked. He'd been thinking about it, he said. There was a company, an early-stage climate tech firm, a former portfolio company of the firm's he'd always believed in more than the rest of the board had. He was considering whether to back it independently. He said it tentatively. The way people said things, they weren't sure they had the right to want yet. Eleanor thought about the 32-year-old who had walked into her firm and surprised her with his instinct for risk. She thought about what survived and what didn't, and what it looked like when someone was beginning to understand what was genuinely theirs. What's the name? She asked. He told her. She said, I'm not the right partner for it, but I know someone in Vancouver who might be. Do you want the introduction? He was quiet for a moment, then, yeah, I'd like that. I'll send her name by end of day, Eleanor said. She paused. Philip, yeah, take care of yourself, she said. She meant it, and he meant it, and she knew he knew it, and that was enough for now. She ended the call. She set the phone on her desk and looked out at Bay Street, and thought about $40 million committed to women who were building something they believed in, and about Constance Reed, who was flying in next week, and about the February light over the city, which was thin and cold, and she had always thought the specific light of things that were only just starting. She thought about the Thornfield Club on a Thursday evening in October, about a young woman in a wheat-colored dress who had raised a glass at the wrong woman in the wrong room, and believed that being seen was the same thing as winning. It wasn't the same thing. It had never been the same thing. Winning was this: her desk, her name on the release, her phone with 16 messages from people who understood what $40 million committed in the right direction actually meant. Winning was Constance Reed's handshake in December. It was Walter's well on the morning of the announcement. It was Jeffrey Strand, on a plane from Vancouver, because Eleanor Ashworth had called and said she thought it was important for him to be there in person. Winning was what happened when you built carefully and waited for the right moment and understood that a room full of people who knew the value of things would always, in the end, understand what they were looking at. The young woman in the wheat-colored dress had stood up in a room like that and asked it to applaud her borrowed position. The room had declined, and Eleanor Ashworth had walked out of that room and spent the 4 months since building something that would outlast every version of the evening that anyone who had been there would ever tell. Not because she needed to prove it. Not because anyone had asked her to. But because that was simply what she did and had always done and would continue to do for as long as the building was in her. The Thornfield Club sent its standard post-event note in November, as it did every year, inquiring about the date for next year's anniversary dinner. Eleanor had Sandra reply the following morning. Same Thursday, she said. Same room. She was not finished with that room yet. She was, if anything, only just beginning to use it correctly.